Hey, what's up? This time, we're going to talk about a story that will make you think twice before walking alone at night. Grab some snacks, turn off the lights, and listen closely.
Daniel Carter never imagined that his journey to Romania would lead to an experience that would change his life forever. A photographer from England, he had spent the last few years traveling to remote locations, documenting abandoned buildings. To him, every structure had a story, and the photographs he captured were not just images but windows into the past. This time, he chose a small Romanian town, one rarely mentioned on tourist maps. Nestled among misty hills, the town had cobblestone streets winding through Gothic-style buildings. The moment he stepped off the train, a chill ran down his spine. The air was colder than expected, the sky overcast, and the wind whistled through the narrow alleys, carrying an eerie stillness. He had booked a room in a modest inn at the far end of the main street. The innkeeper, an old woman with deep wrinkles, stared at him for a long moment before handing him the key without a word. There was no warm welcome, no small talk, only silence and a sense of unspoken tension. That first night passed uneventfully. Exhausted from travel, Daniel barely noticed the strange noises outside his window. But something unsettled him, a feeling that this town was different, as if something unseen lurked within its shadows, waiting to be discovered. The next morning, Daniel set out to explore. He wandered through narrow streets lined with ancient buildings, their windows tightly shut. Many shops appeared long abandoned, though a few still operated, selling intricately carved wooden artifacts and vintage jewelry. Then, he saw it. A small shop stood at the corner of an alley, different from the others. Its wooden sign was faded, barely legible. Dust-covered windows hid the interior, and the door was tightly locked with a rusted chain. Above the entrance, an ornate carving depicted symbols he didn't recognize. Curious, he approached a nearby vendor and asked about the store. The man's expression turned grim, and he simply shook his head. "Stay away," he muttered before hurriedly walking away, as if afraid to even discuss it. Daniel's curiosity deepened. He had visited many abandoned places before, but never had he encountered such fear from the locals. What made this shop so terrifying to them? He was determined to find out. Back at the inn, Daniel tried asking the old innkeeper about the store. He described its location and appearance, hoping she would provide some insight into its history. She sighed deeply, avoiding his gaze. In a hushed voice, she revealed that the shop once belonged to a man named Gregor Vasile, an antique dealer who mysteriously vanished decades ago. No one knew exactly what had happened to him, but rumors suggested he had been involved in something forbidden, something that had led to his disappearance. Since then, the shop had remained untouched. Those who entered it or took anything from within suffered strange fates. Some fell gravely ill, others disappeared without a trace, and a few returned, but not as the same person. Daniel's interest only grew. This was exactly the kind of story he sought. As a photographer, he thrived on capturing eerie, forgotten places with a history of their own. He resolved to return to the shop and see for himself if the rumors were true. That afternoon, Daniel walked back toward the antique store. As he passed a small cafe, he noticed an elderly man sitting alone in the corner, staring at him intently. There was something in the man's gaze, something that made Daniel pause. As he approached, the man spoke without being prompted, his voice low and deliberate. He warned Daniel not to go near the shop. Not because of ghosts or simple superstitions, but for reasons far more disturbing. The shop was not just abandoned. It was waiting. The old man explained that Gregor Vasile was no ordinary merchant. He dealt in objects that were never meant to be owned by ordinary people. Some said he had a mirror that could show the future, a clock that could turn back time, or objects that carried unimaginable curses. Daniel listened, intrigued. But the more he heard, the more convinced he became that this was just another overblown local legend. Every small town had one, a story about a vanished man, a cursed shop, objects that should never be touched. But then, the old man said something that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. The shop doesn't wait for customers. It waits for a new owner. Daniel chuckled, dismissing it as superstition. But the old man did not smile. He simply stared at Daniel for a moment longer, then stood up and walked away without another word. After hearing the warning, Daniel felt an even stronger pull toward the antique shop. It was as if every attempt to steer him away only made it more irresistible. That night, as the town grew silent and the street lamps cast flickering shadows along the cobblestone paths, Daniel grabbed his camera and set out. The wind had grown colder, the alleys darker, and each step he took echoed against the empty streets. When he reached the antique shop, he stood still for a moment, studying it carefully. The dust-covered windows, the locked door, the eerie stillness of it all. But then he noticed something he hadn't before, an old clock hanging above the entrance, its face cracked yet its hands still moving. Despite everything else in the shop being abandoned for decades, the clock was still ticking. Lifting his camera, Daniel took a picture. And with that, he unknowingly set something in motion that could never be undone. Back in his room at the inn, Daniel sat on the bed, flipping through the photos on his camera. Most of them captured the dimly lit streets, the crumbling facades of old buildings, and the eerie silhouette of the antique shop. But as he zoomed in on the picture of the shop's entrance, his heart skipped a beat. Something had changed. When he took the photo, the shop's door had been locked with a rusted chain. But in the image, the chain was missing, and the door was slightly ajar. That wasn't possible. He was sure, absolutely sure, that the door had been sealed shut when he stood there. He had checked twice before taking the shot. A cold sensation crawled up his spine. He flipped to the next photo, one he had taken just moments after the first. This time, the door in the image was wide open. Daniel lowered the camera, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing against him. His mind raced for a logical explanation. A trick of the light? A glitch in the camera? But then, his eyes caught something in the corner of the last photo. A shadow. It was faint, almost blending into the darkness, but unmistakable. The figure of a man standing just beyond the doorway, partially obscured by the gloom. His breath caught in his throat. There had been no one there when he took that picture. Daniel wasn't the type to scare easily. He had spent years exploring abandoned places, hearing whispered legends, and debunking ghost stories. Whatever this was, he needed to see it with his own eyes. The streets were emptier than before as he made his way back to the antique shop. The air felt heavier, thick with an unshakable tension. Even the usual noises of the town, the occasional bark of a stray dog, the distant murmur of voices, seemed to have faded into silence. When he arrived at the shop, his heart pounded. The rusted chain was still in place, just as it had been before. But the sense of unease gnawed at him. Slowly, he raised his camera again, aiming it at the door. The moment he pressed the shutter, a gust of wind slammed against him, rattling the shop's wooden sign overhead. Then, he heard it. A whisper. A voice so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind, except it wasn't. It came from behind the door. Someone was inside. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to remain calm. The logical part of his brain insisted there was nothing supernatural happening. Maybe a squatter had taken refuge inside. Maybe the shop wasn't as abandoned as people claimed. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The street lamp flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows along the cobblestone road. A faint, almost imperceptible sound came from inside the shop, like the slow, deliberate creaking of wood under pressure. He stepped closer, pressing his ear to the door. Silence. Then, something knocked from the other side. 3 soft taps, perfectly spaced apart. Daniel jerked back, his breath hitching. He turned to leave, but just as he took his first step away, the street lamp above him went out, plunging the entire alley into darkness. And then, the knocking came again, louder this time. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his curiosity kept him rooted in place. Slowly, he raised his camera, switching it to night mode. He clicked the shutter. The camera's flash illuminated the interior of the shop for a fraction of a second. And in that brief moment, he saw it. A figure stood just beyond the doorway. A tall, gaunt man dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face partially obscured by the darkness. But his eyes, Daniel saw them clearly. They were wide, hollow, and staring directly at him. Daniel stumbled backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. The camera beeped, processing the image. When the screen lit up, his hands went cold. The figure wasn't there. The shop was empty. But he knew what he had seen. Fear clawed at Daniel's chest as he turned on his heel and bolted down the alleyway. He didn't stop until he reached the main road, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The town, once eerily quiet, now felt suffocatingly unfamiliar. The streetlights, which had been dim but functional before, flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows that twisted unnaturally. The buildings seemed taller, their facades darker, as if something had shifted while he was at the shop. He looked around, disoriented. Something was wrong. The inn should have been just a few blocks away, but the street he was on felt different. The road stretched farther than he remembered, the alleys branching in unfamiliar directions. Even the air smelled strange, thick with something damp and old, like rotting wood and faded perfume. He wasn't lost. The town itself had changed. And somewhere in the distance, just beyond the edge of his hearing, a faint voice whispered his name. Daniel's breathing was uneven as he tried to retrace his steps back to the inn. But no matter which alley he turned into, the road stretched farther than they should, bending in directions that defied logic. It was as if the town itself was shifting, leading him away from safety. Then, he heard it again. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and just far enough behind him that he couldn't see who, or what, was there. At first, he thought it might be another traveler or a local passing through. But as he picked up his pace, so did the footsteps. When he slowed, they slowed too. The realization hit him like ice down his spine. He wasn't walking alone. A quick glance over his shoulder revealed nothing but empty streets. The dim glow of flickering streetlights barely illuminated the narrow alleys, leaving deep pockets of darkness where anything, or anyone, could be hiding. Swallowing hard, he gripped his camera and forced himself to keep moving. If he could just reach the inn, he would be fine. At least, that's what he told himself. The air felt heavier with each step, pressing against his skin like an invisible weight. He could sense something, someone, just out of sight. The presence wasn't just following him, it was watching him. His instincts screamed at him to run, but fear rooted him to the spot. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he turned his head ever so slightly, peering into the nearest alley. A shadow moved. Not in the way a person would. This shadow glided, stretching unnaturally along the walls before disappearing behind a building. It had no definite form, no clear figure. Just an overwhelming sense of something old, something unnatural. The cold breath of night curled around his neck, and though no wind stirred, he felt it, a whisper against his skin, a breath that was not his own. Daniel clenched his fists, forcing his legs to move again. Every instinct screamed that he wasn't safe, but stopping would be worse. Whatever was following him, it didn't want him to leave. He had to document this. If this was a trick of the light, a hallucination from exhaustion, his camera would prove it. His fingers trembled as he lifted the camera, aiming it at the empty street behind him. He pressed the shutter. The flash burst through the darkness, momentarily illuminating the scene. The image processed on the screen, and Daniel's stomach twisted. There, standing just a few feet behind him, was the same gaunt figure in the old-fashioned suit. The man's hollow eyes stared directly into the lens, his lips parted slightly as if whispering something. But that wasn't the worst part. In the reflection of a nearby window, there was no man. Only Daniel. And the longer he stared at the image, the more he felt something closing in. The silence was broken by something soft but insistent. A whisper. At first, it was faint, like the wind slipping through cracks in an old house. But then, it became clearer, closer. Not one voice, but many, overlapping and tangled, speaking in a language he didn't understand. The words slithered into his ears, crawling beneath his skin, filling his mind with a suffocating presence. It wasn't just sound, it was weight, as if the whispers were sinking into his bones, rooting him to the spot. His vision blurred at the edges. His breathing turned shallow. He knew, if he listened for too long, he wouldn't be able to move again. Desperately, he shut his eyes, forcing himself to move. 1 foot forward. Then another. The whispers clawed at his mind, but he fought against them. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The air went still. The silence was too complete, as if the world itself had paused. He didn't dare turn around. Instead, he ran. By the time Daniel reached the inn, his lungs burned, and his legs ached. He pushed through the door, slamming it shut behind him. The warmth of the dimly lit lobby should have brought him comfort. It didn't. The old innkeeper, who had been sitting at the front desk earlier, was gone. The reception bell remained untouched, the fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers. Something felt off. The air smelled different, like dust and something older, like the scent of forgotten rooms untouched for decades. The walls seemed darker, the wooden floors duller, as if the place had aged overnight. And then, he noticed it. The clock on the wall. Before, it had been ticking, a steady rhythm that filled the quiet space. But now, its hands were frozen at 3:15 a.m. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe the fear was making him see patterns where there were none. He just needed to rest. But as he turned toward the staircase leading to his room, a realization crept into his mind, sending a fresh wave of dread through him. He had left his room unlocked. And now, the door was slightly open. Standing at the bottom of the staircase, Daniel stared at the slightly open door of his room. He had left it shut, maybe even locked, he couldn't remember for certain in his panic. But one thing was clear, it hadn't been open when he left. A sharp unease crawled over his skin. The hallway was silent, but the kind of silence that felt too deliberate, as if something was waiting. The dim, flickering light from the single bulb overhead cast long, shifting shadows against the walls. His gut told him to turn around, to leave. But his feet carried him forward. Each step up the staircase felt heavier than the last. The closer he got to the door, the more suffocating the air became. He gripped the camera in his hand like a lifeline, his fingers slick with sweat. With a shallow breath, he nudged the door open. The room was dark, the air inside colder than it should have been. The curtains fluttered slightly, though the window was closed. And then he saw it. His camera bag, still where he had left it. But his notebook was open, the pages disturbed as if someone had flipped through them. Someone, or something, had been inside. Daniel's hands trembled as he approached the desk. The notebook, which had been neatly closed before, now lay open on a random page. But it wasn't random. The page had been defaced. The once blank paper was filled with deep, jagged scratches, not written with a pen, but something sharper, like a nail or a blade. At first, they looked like senseless scribbles, but as he stepped closer, his breath caught. It was writing. The words were messy, erratic, some overlapping each other, as if written by multiple hands at once. But he could still make out the message. Do not look at him. His stomach lurched. His mind screamed at him to get out, to burn the notebook, to pretend he never saw it. But instead, he reached out, almost against his own will, tracing his fingers over the scratched words. The moment his skin touched the page, something shifted behind him. A soft rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. Daniel froze. He wasn't alone. Every instinct told him not to turn around. But the air behind him had changed, thickening with something unseen, something watching. Slowly, he reached for his camera, lifting it with stiff fingers. Without turning, he raised it slightly and clicked the shutter. The flash burst through the darkness, lighting up the room for a fraction of a second. He saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room, partially obscured by shadow. It was tall, dressed in the same tattered old suit from before. The face was blurry, but the eyes, empty and hollow, were locked onto him. Daniel's breath hitched. His hands clenched around the camera as the image processed. When the screen lit up, his blood ran cold. The figure wasn't in the photo. But when he lifted his eyes back to the corner, it was closer. His survival instincts kicked in. Daniel didn't wait. He lunged for the door, heart pounding as he reached for the handle, only to find it stuck. No, locked. He twisted and pulled, but the knob wouldn't budge. The air in the room thickened, pressing against him like a heavy fog. His vision blurred at the edges, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The sound of shuffling fabric scraped against the floor behind him. He slammed his fist against the door, desperation clawing at his throat. And then, a whisper. Right against his ear. You took the photo. A hand, ice cold, brushed against the back of his neck. Daniel screamed. As if the force had toyed with him enough, the door suddenly flew open. Daniel stumbled into the hallway, nearly collapsing as he gasped for air. He turned sharply, expecting to see the figure standing there. But the room was empty. His notebook lay untouched on the desk. His camera bag was zipped. The curtains were still. For a moment, he thought, maybe it had all been in his head. Maybe the fear, the exhaustion, had played tricks on him. But then, he glanced at his camera. His fingerprint was still smeared across the screen, where he had clutched it in fear. And the last photo he had taken, the one that showed the figure in the corner, had changed. Now, the figure was gone. But in its place, there was something new. Words had appeared, written in the same jagged, claw-like script from his notebook. You cannot leave. Daniel slammed the door shut behind him, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out the silence of the dimly lit hallway. He gripped his camera tightly, his fingers sore from how hard he had been holding it. For a moment, he just stood there, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was the exhaustion. He had been traveling non-stop, barely sleeping. His mind could be playing tricks on him, twisting shadows into figures, turning creaking wood into whispers. The human brain was known for filling in the gaps when faced with the unknown. That had to be it. But when his gaze drifted back to the screen of his camera, the message was still there. You cannot leave. His fingers felt ice cold against the plastic. No. This was real. The whispers. The shadow. The thing that had brushed against his neck. He had never felt fear like that before, pure, that wrenching terror that left no room for doubt. Daniel exhaled shakily, shutting his eyes. He needed to calm down. Panicking wouldn't help. He was still in the inn, still in a place with other people. He just had to get through the night. Tomorrow, he would leave. If the town let him. The hours dragged on, but Daniel barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt as if someone was standing over him, waiting for him to let his guard down. The weight of unseen eyes bore into his skin, making it impossible to rest. When the first slivers of sunlight slipped through the curtains, he felt a brief moment of relief. Morning. Whatever haunted this town, whatever was watching him, hadn't gotten to him. Yet. Determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and the inn, Daniel gathered his things in record time. He shoved his camera into his bag, zipped up his jacket, and swung the door open. Only to freeze. The hallway was wrong. The wallpaper, which had been a dull beige last night, was now peeled and yellowed, as if it had aged decades overnight. The wooden floorboards were warped, creaking under his weight even though they had been sturdy just hours ago. The light bulbs flickered dimly, their glow weaker than before. A deep, unsettling dread curled in his stomach. Had the inn always looked this old? He took slow steps toward the reception area, his unease growing with each step. The lobby, once small but welcoming, now reeked of dust and decay. The fireplace was nothing but cold ash. The front desk was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had touched it for years. And the innkeeper? Nowhere to be seen. Daniel pushed through the inn's entrance, stepping outside into the town square. A bitter chill clung to the air, sharper than it had been the day before. The streets, which had been eerily quiet but alive, now felt completely abandoned. No murmuring voices. No distant footsteps. No faint clatter of dishes from a nearby cafe. Just silence. His boots scuffed against the cobblestones as he walked toward the main road, scanning for any sign of life. The market stalls, once filled with fresh produce and trinkets, were now empty, their awnings swaying slightly in the breeze. A bicycle leaned against a wall, its tires half deflated, as if left there for years. A single newspaper lay on the ground, its pages fluttering. Daniel bent down to pick it up, but the second his fingers brushed against the damp paper, a sharp chill shot through him. The date on the newspaper. It wasn't yesterday's. It wasn't even from this year. It was from 1964. His pulse spiked. He dropped the newspaper, stumbling backward. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing, what he was feeling. Had the entire town changed overnight? Or had it always been like this, and he was only now seeing the truth? The air felt heavier, denser, as if the town itself was watching him. Daniel clenched his fists, trying to keep himself grounded. This had to be a dream. It had to be. Then, the bell rang. A single, deep chime echoed through the empty streets. It came from somewhere beyond the town square, toward the direction of the old shop, the one where he had first seen the strange merchant. Another chime followed. Daniel turned toward the sound, his breath catching in his throat. He had no reason to go back. No reason to step 1 foot closer to that place. But something, a force, an instinct, a presence, was pulling him forward. The bell rang a third time. And without fully realizing it, his feet started moving. Daniel walked through the streets, past the empty stalls, past the abandoned buildings, until he stood before the shop. It looked different. The boarded-up windows were now clean, revealing a dimly lit interior. The dusty old sign, once unreadable, now gleamed as if freshly painted. The scent of old wood and something metallic seeped into the air, curling into his lungs. The door was open. Inside, a dim glow flickered from within, casting long shadows against the walls. A single oil lamp sat on the counter, its flame swaying despite the still air. And standing behind the counter. The merchant. The same gaunt man in the old-fashioned suit, his thin lips curled into the faintest of smiles. His hollow eyes locked onto Daniel's. And in his skeletal fingers, he held something small, something wrapped in cloth. Something that Daniel knew belonged to him. His notebook. The one he had left in his room. The one that should still be at the inn. The merchant's smile widened. "You cannot leave," the wind whispered. Daniel's stomach dropped. He had never told anyone about the message in his camera. His legs moved forward, but he wasn't the one commanding them. Daniel's mind screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to run as fast as he could in the opposite direction. But his body didn't listen. One step. Then another. The old wooden floorboards groaned beneath his weight as he crossed the threshold of the shop. The air inside was thick, carrying the scent of aged wood, burnt oil, and something decayed. His breath hitched as the door slowly creaked shut behind him, sealing him in. The merchant stood behind the counter, just as he had the first time. But now, in the dim glow of the oil lamp, Daniel saw something different about him. His suit wasn't just old, it was rotting. The once black fabric was frayed, eaten away at the edges. The buttons were tarnished, barely hanging onto the loose threads. And his hands. Daniel's stomach churned. The merchant's fingers weren't flesh and bone. They were long, darkened, and shriveled, as if mummified, yet they still moved with eerie precision. With a slow, deliberate movement, the merchant unwrapped the cloth in his hands. Daniel's notebook lay beneath the fabric, its pages still curled from where he had last touched them. But there was something new inside. The ink. The scratches. They had spread. The once small, erratic warnings had grown, stretching across multiple pages, forming strange symbols and spiraling patterns. The words "do not look at him" were now surrounded by other frantic messages. It's too late. He sees you. You belong to him. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He tried to turn around, to flee. But his feet wouldn't move. A heavy silence filled the air between them. The merchant tilted his head slightly, his hollow eyes locked onto Daniel's. His thin lips never parted, yet Daniel heard his voice as clear as if it had been whispered right into his ear. You should not have taken the photo. The voice was inside his head. A rasping, hollow murmur that sent a shiver crawling down his spine. Daniel's throat was dry. His breathing was shallow. He couldn't respond, even if he wanted to. The merchant lifted his withered hand and slowly slid the notebook across the counter toward him. Daniel didn't want to take it. But his body, against his will, reached out. His fingers brushed against the cover. The second he made contact, a violent chill shot up his arm, like a jolt of electricity surging through his veins. His vision blurred. The shop flickered around him, as if reality itself was glitching. The shelves warped. The lamplight dimmed to an unnatural darkness. Shadows stretched toward him. And then. A single breath against the back of his neck. Something was behind him. A low hissing sound filled the shop. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, his fingers gripping the notebook like a lifeline. The air shifted. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't in the shop anymore. The walls had melted into blackness, stretching into an endless void. The merchant was gone. The shelves, the counter, the oil lamp, all of it had vanished. He stood in a vast, empty space. A heavy fog rolled across the ground, swallowing everything below his knees. There was no light, yet he could see. And then. A shape emerged from the fog. It was tall, unnaturally so. Its form was draped in tattered black fabric, its head tilted downward, as if watching him. The face was hidden, no, not hidden. It simply wasn't there. The figure stood motionless. But Daniel knew. It was waiting. Waiting for him to acknowledge it. Waiting for him to see it. His chest felt tight, like a pair of invisible hands were slowly pressing against his ribs. His mind screamed at him, do not look at him. But it was too late. His gaze locked onto the figure. The second their eyes, or lack thereof, met, the figure's head snapped upright. The darkness rushed toward him. A sharp gasp tore from Daniel's throat. His body jerked violently, his chest heaving as his lungs sucked in a breath. He was back. The shop was gone. The merchant was gone. He was lying in his bed, inside the inn. For a moment, he was too stunned to move. His entire body ached, as if he had been dropped from a great height. His mind swam in a haze, memories of what had just happened slipping through his fingers like sand. Had it been a dream? Had he imagined it all? His gaze drifted toward the nightstand. His hands trembled as he reached out. His fingers brushed against the worn leather cover of his notebook. It was still there. Slowly, with mounting dread, he flipped it open. The pages were blank. Every frantic scribble, every jagged warning, gone. But as he turned to the last page, his breath caught. One single line had been written at the very bottom, in handwriting that wasn't his. "You looked." A sharp knock at the door sent a shockwave through Daniel's body. He froze. The knock came again. Slow. Rhythmic. Too deliberate. His fingers gripped the edges of his blanket. His pulse hammered against his ribs. His eyes flickered to the clock on the wall. 3:33 a.m. Nobody should be knocking at his door. The inn had felt abandoned just hours ago. He held his breath. Then. The doorknob twisted. A slow, deliberate movement. Daniel's blood turned to ice. The door wasn't locked. And whatever was on the other side was coming in. Daniel's breath hitched as the doorknob turned with an agonizing slowness. The wood groaned. The hinges let out a long, drawn-out creak as the door swung inward. Beyond it, nothing but darkness. Not the hallway. Not the dim, candlelit corridor of the inn. Just a void. A yawning, suffocating blackness that stretched into nothingness. Daniel's entire body tensed. His instincts screamed at him to move, to run, to do anything but just sit there, frozen in his bed. But something about that doorway, something about that darkness, held him captive. It wasn't just empty space. It was watching him. Something was there. Something standing in the dark, just beyond his sight. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and unnatural, slithering forward inch by inch. His mind flashed back to the warning in his notebook. Do not look at him. Daniel clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into the sheets. Too late. He already had. A breath. Soft. Close. Too close. It sent an icy shudder down his spine, making the fine hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The air around him grew heavier, pressing against his chest like invisible hands were slowly pushing down. Then, a whisper. You let me in. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't deep, or high-pitched, or even distorted. It was just wrong. Like 1,000 voices layered together, spoken from a place that shouldn't exist. Daniel's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from his ribs. He wanted to scream. He wanted to move. But his body was locked in place, his limbs paralyzed by an overwhelming, primal fear. Something stepped forward from the blackness. It didn't make a sound. But Daniel felt it. Felt the shift in the air, the growing presence of something that should never have been allowed into this world. The walls of the inn room began to warp. The wallpaper peeled away in long, curling strips, revealing something blackened and pulsing beneath. The wooden floorboards twisted, the grain shifting like it was trying to form words that Daniel couldn't read. The bed beneath him creaked, the mattress sinking as if something else was lying there with him. Daniel's throat clenched. His body was still frozen, trapped between reality and something else, something older, darker. He tried to focus on the details, anything to ground himself. The chair in the corner of the room was gone. The desk, which had been cluttered with his belongings, was now bare. His camera, his only proof that anything had happened, was missing. Then, he noticed something even worse. The mirror on the wall. It hadn't been there before. And in its reflection. He wasn't alone. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps as he forced himself to look at the mirror. At it. At the thing standing behind him. It wasn't a shadow, wasn't a vague figure hiding in the dim light. It was clear, horribly detailed. And it looked almost human. Its limbs were too long, its skin stretched too thin over unnatural bones. Its face, if it could be called that, was featureless except for a wide, gaping mouth, curling into a grin that shouldn't be possible. But the worst part? It was mimicking him. Every panicked breath, every slight tremor of his fingers, it copied perfectly. Like it was learning him. The realization made something inside him snap. His body was his again. The paralysis broke. And for the first time, Daniel moved. The second he could move, Daniel bolted. He didn't look back. He didn't stop to check if the thing in the mirror was following him. He just ran. His bare feet pounded against the warped wooden floor. The walls twisted around him, shifting as if trying to trap him inside. He reached the door, gripping the handle, yanking. It wouldn't budge. The whisper came again, curling through the air like smoke. "You cannot leave." Daniel turned, his chest rising and falling with panicked breaths. The door wasn't locked. It wasn't stuck. It was gone. Where it had once been, there was now only more wall, seamless, as if no door had ever existed. His escape route was gone. And from somewhere in the room, in the places where shadows stretched impossibly long, something laughed. The laughter faded into the walls, like it was seeping into the wood itself. Daniel pressed his palms against the spot where the door had been, his breath ragged. The wall felt solid, not like something that had just transformed, but as if it had always been that way. Like he had never entered through a door at all. His pulse hammered against his ribs. He turned his head, scanning the room, trying to anchor himself. But something was wrong. The furniture, his bed, the nightstand, the mirror, was gone. In its place was a long, narrow hallway, stretching out endlessly ahead of him. The wallpaper was peeling, curling at the edges like dried flesh, revealing a damp, rotting surface underneath. The air smelled of mildew and something sour. This wasn't the inn anymore. At least, not the one he had fallen asleep in. The hallway loomed before him, dark and waiting. There was no turning back. Daniel swallowed hard and took a step forward. Then another. The silence pressed against his ears, heavy and unnatural. No creaking floorboards. No distant wind. Nothing. Just the steady, rhythmic sound of his own breath. He kept walking. 5 steps. 10. 20. No change. The hallway stretched on, no doors, no windows, no turns, just an endless, suffocating corridor that shouldn't exist. His stomach twisted. Had he been walking for minutes? Or hours? He glanced behind him. And his heart stopped. The hallway had changed. It was no longer empty. Far down at the end, barely visible through the dim, flickering light, a silhouette stood. Tall. Motionless. Watching him. Daniel's body tensed, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its head slightly tilted, like it was studying him. His instincts screamed for him to run, but where? There was nowhere to go. He blinked. The figure was closer. It hadn't moved. It hadn't stepped forward. It had just shifted. Daniel's fingers curled into fists. He took a slow, shaky step backward. The light overhead flickered. Another blink. And the figure was even closer. He could see it clearer now. The same black fabric, draped over an impossibly thin frame. Its head lowered, its shape distorted like it wasn't meant to exist in this reality. The light flickered again. The figure disappeared. And suddenly, from behind him, a breath. Right against his ear. Daniel launched forward, his legs moving before his mind could process what had just happened. His heart pounded, his breath came in ragged gasps. He didn't care if there was nowhere to go, he just ran. The hallway twisted around him, the peeling wallpaper pulsing like it was alive. The air thickened, weighing on his shoulders, slowing him down. The laughter came again. Not behind him. Not ahead. Everywhere. The light above dimmed. Shadows stretched across the walls, moving too fast, shifting like they were reaching for him. He could hear footsteps now, not his. They came from all directions, echoing through the narrow space. Some close, some far away, some right beside him. And then, a door appearing out of nowhere, just a few steps ahead. Daniel lunged for it, his fingers wrapping around the handle, twisting. The door swung open. And he fell through. The sensation of falling lasted only a second, but when Daniel's feet hit the ground, he wasn't in the hallway anymore. He was back. Back in the merchant's shop. The wooden counter. The dusty shelves. The faint smell of burnt oil. It was exactly the same as before. Except for one thing. The merchant wasn't behind the counter. Instead, standing in the very spot where he had last seen the old man, was himself. Daniel. Staring back at him with hollow, empty eyes. And in his hand, he held the notebook. Open to the last page. The writing was no longer frantic scribbles. It was a single sentence. A message. Welcome back. The air in the shop felt thick, like the walls were closing in around him. Daniel's legs wobbled beneath him as he stood frozen, staring at the figure behind the counter. The figure that looked exactly like him, his face, his clothes, but with hollow eyes that seemed to stare into the very core of his being. It raised a hand slowly, and Daniel's heart skipped a beat. It was holding the notebook. The same notebook that had been his only connection to this twisted reality. The figure opened it to the last page, and the writing shifted before Daniel's eyes, as if it were being written in real time. Welcome back. The words seemed to reverberate in his mind, like an echo that refused to fade. He stumbled backward, but his feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. What was happening? How was this possible? Was this really him, or was he caught in some kind of twisted reflection? The figure behind the counter began to smile, its grin wide, stretching unnaturally. It looked too much like a mockery of his own face. The wooden counter, the shelves, the old lanterns, everything seemed to blur and melt together. The walls seemed to stretch and breathe, like the shop itself was alive, twisting around him. Daniel's skin prickled with a sudden chill, and he looked around, panic flooding his veins. The shelves weren't just full of goods anymore. The items on them had changed. There were fragments of things, broken mirrors, cracked porcelain dolls, and jars of unidentifiable liquids. The air smelled like rotting wood and something far more foul, a mix of mold and decay. The wooden floors beneath him creaked under his feet, but now, there was an unsettling rhythm to the sound. It was as if the floorboards were tapping in time with something unseen. Daniel's chest tightened. He looked at the figure again. It hadn't moved, but its eyes never left him. He felt the presence of something behind him, and when he turned, there was nothing. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable, as if the walls themselves were staring at him. Every corner of the shop now seemed to hide something dark, something that wasn't meant to be seen. The shelves seemed to hum with a presence, as if the items on them had their own eyes. Then the whispering started again. This time, it wasn't in his ear. It came from everywhere. The voice was low, almost incomprehensible, but there was one word that Daniel could make out. You. It was repeated over and over, a chanting that seemed to echo off the walls, bouncing off every surface in the shop. Daniel's eyes darted around, his heart racing. He couldn't tell where the voice was coming from. He didn't know if he was hearing it from the shop, or if it was coming from inside his own mind. It wasn't just a whisper. It felt like the world itself was speaking to him, telling him something he didn't want to understand. The figure behind the counter finally moved, but its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was savoring each step. It leaned forward, and Daniel flinched, every instinct screaming to run. But his legs refused to move. It spoke then. The voice was his. It was his own voice. You are just like me, it said, its smile never fading. Daniel's blood turned to ice. I was once you. The words clawed at his mind, sinking into his thoughts like poisonous vines. The figure slowly stood upright, towering over him. Its grin stretched wider, impossible, as if it was too big for its face. "You'll never leave." Daniel could feel the walls of the shop closing in again, the air suffocating him. He looked at the notebook in the figure's hands again. The page had changed once more. It was now filled with more writing, creeping across the page like an unstoppable force, ink pooling and spreading. "This is your fate. You're mine now." The last thing Daniel saw was the notebook, the page now drenched in ink, consuming the writing. The words became a blur, swirling and melting into the paper. His heartbeat thudded in his chest as he reached out to grab it, but his hands passed right through it. The notebook disintegrated into a fine dust that was quickly absorbed into the walls. And then, the floor opened beneath him. The ground gave way, and Daniel found himself falling once more. Falling. Not into darkness, but into a place that felt like the very core of this nightmare. The shop had consumed him. And it was no longer just an inn, or a shop, or even a cursed place. It was now his prison. He was trapped in a curse, not just as a victim, but as part of the curse itself. Daniel's mind swirled in chaos as he sank into the floor. His body vibrated with an intense, unnatural energy as if the very air around him was charged with something that wasn't supposed to exist. His vision blurred. He could feel himself slipping through the cracks of reality, pulled into a space between worlds. For what felt like an eternity, he couldn't tell if he was still falling or if he had already hit the ground. His body twisted and contorted, reshaping itself to fit into the unseen space he had entered. It was as though his very soul was being pulled apart and reassembled by forces beyond comprehension. When his feet finally touched ground, there was a terrifying stillness. The world around him was dark, but not like the night. It wasn't black, it was a deep, suffocating void that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. There were no stars, no light, no hope. Just an overwhelming silence. He took a step forward. The ground was cold, rough, like he was standing on stone, but it felt alive, like it was moving beneath him. The air around him shifted, pressing in, weighing down on him. Then, a low growl came from the darkness. A sound that rumbled in his chest, reverberating through his very bones. Something watched him. Daniel stood frozen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the presence of something ancient, something malevolent watching him from the depths of the dark void. The growling grew louder, more distinct, more dangerous. Then, the shadows began to shift. It wasn't like anything he had seen before. These shadows moved, slithering across the ground like tendrils of smoke or ink, swirling in a pattern that didn't seem to make sense. They grew, stretching out, taking shape, forming something. At first, it was barely noticeable, just the faintest outline, the faintest hint of something solid emerging from the darkness. But then, it became clearer. A figure. Tall. Inhuman. Its eyes, black, empty voids, stared straight at him. No pupils, no expression, just an all-consuming darkness that seemed to look right through him. The figure stepped forward. And with each step, the ground beneath him trembled, as if something ancient and hungry was waking. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Daniel spun around, looking for an escape, but the shadows seemed to block every direction. He stumbled backward, every instinct screaming for him to run, to find any way out of this dark, twisted place. But the figure was too close now. Too real. Its limbs were long, skeletal, and twisted, like they had been bent and reshaped for something otherworldly. It reached out with a spindly arm, its fingers elongating into sharp claws, scraping against the stone ground with a sound like grinding metal. Daniel's stomach turned, nausea rising in his throat. But his body refused to move. He tried to fight, to push himself forward, but the air around him held him in place, pulling at him, draining him. The figure moved closer, its eyes locked on his, unblinking, empty. His body felt like it was collapsing under the weight of its presence. The figure finally spoke. The words were not in any language he knew. They were harsh, guttural, filled with a chilling vibration that rattled his bones. The sound echoed through the void, surrounding him from all sides, filling his mind with thousands of whispers, all speaking at once. Daniel could barely understand the words, but the meaning was clear. It wasn't speaking to him. It was commanding him. "You belong here now," the figure said. Its voice was deep, resonating like the rumble of thunder, though it wasn't loud, just all-encompassing. The words echoed in his mind. He could feel them settling in his soul, making him question everything he had known about himself. Was he really who he thought he was? Was he trapped in a nightmare, or was this his new reality? The shadows around him twisted more violently, writhing as if the figure's words were alive and feeding on his fear. The figure stepped closer, its skeletal hand reaching out, and Daniel instinctively backed away. But there was nowhere to go. He was surrounded. Then, a strange calm fell over him. The growling stopped. The whispering ceased. The air, once thick with dread, felt heavy with expectation. The figure looked down at him, its hollow eyes filled with something, almost like satisfaction. It spoke again, this time in a voice that cut through the silence. "Choose. Stay, and become one with us. Or leave, and take your chance in the world that remains." But the figure's words carried a weight, an overwhelming pressure. Leave? Daniel thought. What was left for him to go back to? What was left in the world he had once known? The figure's presence was so strong, so all-consuming, that he could feel the very fabric of his identity being pulled apart. The darkness of the void began to reach out to him, trying to pull him in. He felt his legs buckle beneath him, but still, he stood. The choice seemed impossible, like he was bound to make the wrong decision no matter what he chose. The decision weighed heavily on Daniel. His legs trembled, but his mind was sharper than ever, torn between the temptation to embrace this dark power and the fear of losing everything that once made him human. The figure hovered before him, its presence so suffocating that it seemed to compress the air, making each breath a struggle. The shadows that writhed around it seemed to feed off his hesitation, swirling like hungry serpents waiting for him to fall into their grasp. Daniel could feel himself being pulled inward toward the void. The edges of his vision darkened, as though the very space around him was trying to consume him. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. He was trapped, locked in this place between worlds, unable to escape. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, and he realized that this wasn't just some decision. It was a test, a final judgment. If he gave in, he would become another part of the cursed shop, another piece of the dark force that had claimed so many before him. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing, to push back the growing panic. The choice was supposed to be his, but it didn't feel like a choice at all. He could feel the shadows pulling harder, wrapping around his limbs like chains, tightening with every second. The figure's voice echoed in his mind again, speaking in a language that wasn't just words, it was a command. There is no escape, Daniel. The voice was a mixture of something old, ancient, and horribly familiar. He could hear the whispers of others, those who had fallen before him, trapped in the same loop. Their voices filled the void, their words merging into a chorus of misery and regret. This is your fate now. You belong to the shop. You belong to the curse. Daniel wanted to scream, wanted to fight back. But he couldn't. The darkness was too powerful. The figure's eyes burned into his soul, forcing him to confront the horrible truth. If he resisted, he would be lost forever in this place. But if he accepted, what would become of him? Just as Daniel felt himself losing control, a flash of memory pierced through the dark haze. He saw his family's faces, his mother's gentle smile, his father's reassuring voice. He remembered his life before all of this, the world outside, where things made sense. A moment of clarity washed over him. He was not just the victim of this curse. He had a past, a future, a life waiting for him. He wasn't meant to be a part of this eternal nightmare. The figure's grip on his mind tightened, trying to silence these memories, to push him deeper into the void. But Daniel held on to them with all his strength, his desire to escape surging. He wasn't sure if he was ready to make the choice, but he knew that he couldn't just give in. As Daniel's resolve strengthened, the air around him shifted. It wasn't just the oppressive weight of the void anymore. Something changed, something new. The shadows around him began to tremble, and the figure that stood before him seemed to falter for just a moment. Daniel's chest constricted as the ground beneath him shifted, cracking open, sending waves of tremors through the space. The figure stepped back slightly, its expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in its eyes, fear. For the first time, Daniel saw the figure hesitate. The shadows that had once seemed like they were in control now seemed to be flinching, as if something was challenging their power. It was almost as if the curse itself was being tested. Daniel realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. The curse, the shop, the very darkness that had surrounded him, it all had a purpose. The figure, the darkness, it wasn't just trying to consume him. It was watching him, testing his strength, seeing if he could break through its grip. Suddenly, the figure spoke again, its voice softer, more calculated. There was a shift in its tone, an offer, something new. "You have a choice," the figure said, its voice tinged with a hint of desperation. "I can give you what you want. I can return you to the world you came from, if you agree to serve me." Daniel felt a chill run through him as the words settled in his mind. "All I ask is for your soul, your allegiance. The choice is yours." The figure's words echoed through him like a twisted temptation. The promise of escape, of returning to the world he knew, was enough to make his heart race. But the cost was high, far higher than he could imagine. Serve the curse. Become its agent. The figure's eyes burned brighter now, as if it could sense his inner conflict. "Think carefully, Daniel. Choose wisely." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He was caught between two worlds, one where he could escape, but at the cost of his very soul, and another where he would face an endless battle in the dark void. Daniel stood motionless, the air thick with the weight of the figure's words. His heart pounded against his chest, every beat echoing in the void. The figure watched him, its hollow eyes unblinking, waiting for him to make the ultimate decision. The tension was unbearable. Every instinct in Daniel screamed for him to choose escape, to return to the world he once knew. But the price, the sacrifice, was a heavy one. The promise of freedom in exchange for his soul felt like a trap he couldn't escape. His mind raced, torn between his humanity and the fear of being trapped forever in the cursed void. He thought of his family, of the life he had left behind, of everything he could lose. Could he really give it all up, even for the chance to return home? The figure's voice broke through his thoughts. It was soft, almost coaxing, like a parent tempting a child to accept a gift. "The world you left behind is fading. You may not even belong there anymore. But here, you can be more than you ever dreamed." For a moment, the darkness around him seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though it were alive, offering him power beyond imagination. Daniel could feel the temptation, the urge to take the figure's offer, to embrace the darkness, and to control the very forces that had threatened to consume him. His body trembled with the power that seemed to pulse through the air. A voice in his mind whispered, "It's not too late. You can have everything." He could feel the promise of freedom, the allure of escaping the nightmare, no longer a prisoner of this ancient curse. But at what cost? Would he still be Daniel if he gave in? Would the darkness change him, twist him into something unrecognizable? His hands clenched into fists. No, he couldn't let that happen. He had fought so hard to hold on to his humanity, to keep his memories and the life he had left behind. The choice wasn't just about freedom. It was about his soul, his very identity. Just as the figure's words seemed to grow louder, more enticing, a sudden flash of light broke through the void. It was a small, almost imperceptible light, but it grew brighter with each passing second, as if it were a beacon in the darkness. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The light wasn't from the figure, but from somewhere deeper within himself. Could this be the will to escape? The final strength to reject the darkness? The figure's expression twisted into something far darker, its eyes narrowing as if sensing the change within Daniel. "You will regret this," the figure hissed, its voice like a threat. "No one escapes us." But Daniel didn't listen. His gaze fixed on the light, the beacon of hope that now burned brighter than the shadows that surrounded him. He could feel the urge to fight swelling inside him, the need to escape, to refuse the curse's control. Without another thought, Daniel made his decision. The darkness around him seemed to recoil as he took a step toward the light, his feet moving against the pull of the void. He refused to be consumed, to lose himself to the curse. He reached out with everything he had, pushing through the darkness that had tried to swallow him. The air grew thinner, the shadows flickered and faded as he forced his way toward the light. And then, for the first time since his arrival in this cursed space, he felt free, as though the chains that had bound him were finally breaking. The figure screamed in frustration, its form shifting and writhing in anger as it tried to reclaim him. But it was too late. Daniel's hand closed around the light, and the world around him shattered. The darkness erupted into a blinding flash, and Daniel was thrown backward, his mind spinning. He could feel himself falling, the world around him splitting apart. The next thing he knew, he was back in the world he knew, standing on solid ground, gasping for air. The familiar sounds of the real world returned, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant hum of city life. For a moment, Daniel thought it had all been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by fear. But the memory of the curse, the figure, the shadows, the choice, still lingered in his mind. He knew that it wasn't over. The curse wasn't gone, not truly. It was waiting, biding its time. And sooner or later, it would come for him again. Daniel wasn't free, he had merely escaped, for now. The figure's words echoed in his mind one final time as the world around him began to fade. "You can never escape us. We are always watching." The screen fades to black.
That was our story for tonight. Do you think it's just an ordinary tale, or is there something more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. See you if you still dare to watch next time.